Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Ben Brewster, Tread Athletics. Another highly requested breakdown for you guys, this time on Mason Miller. Obviously, Mason's kind of come out of nowhere in the last year or two, and honestly, one of the more exciting guys to watch in the league, in my opinion. Obviously, some of the most electric stuff. Just kind of going through some of his absolute dominance this year in particular. Really, just pick your stat. He's at the top of the league in just about everything. Expected ERA, expected batting average, fastball velo, whiff percentage, K percentage, hard hit percentage, 95th percentile in barrel percentage, 98th percentile chase percentage. Not hard to see why with a guy who sits almost 101 miles an hour, regularly touching 102, 103 plus miles an hour. So pretty exciting stuff. And actually, if you look at his stats to this point, 1.26 ERA, if anything, undercounts how dominant he's been. His FIP is actually 0.05. So he's actually been pitching better than the numbers would suggest. So let's go ahead, dive right into the breakdown itself. And then we're going to talk a little bit about his arsenal and how he got to this point. I want to talk about the framework through which, I think of and address mechanics, so that as we kind of go through piece by piece and what I'm seeing kind of gives you guys some awareness and context of how that fits into the overarching theme of high-level mechanics. Really, this is a problem of how do we convert linear momentum into angular momentum and get as much of that energy or momentum into the ball as possible. Obviously, there's command considerations here as well. So if we kind of go through general mechanical framework, there's that initial first move, the drift, there's the hinge or linear move where you ride the backside. Again, you're building that linear momentum, and then that's when you convert it in the rotate phase. You unload the pelvis, you rotate the pelvis down into landing, using that move to properly time and unload the pelvis, and then transfer that energy rotationally up into the torso. The block phase has to do with the lead leg and actually getting a firm plant, being able to send the energy up into the upper half. When we look at the upper half, again, simplified way of looking at it, you really have the arm path or arm spiral. So everything from handbrake until the actual flip up or landing position. And then we have the acceleration and deceleration phases. So everything from how does that arm actually accelerate into ball release and then decelerate after ball release. And then there's some general themes as well that kind of underpin the entire delivery as a whole. Rhythm, how well does everything kind of sync up and flow together? Tempo, how fast does he move down the mound? Intent, overall intensity, is he applying to that baseball, and what's the timing of that intensity? So that's the kind of the general framework through which we evaluate mechanics. Obviously, there's a lot more detail that goes into each one of these, but again, let's dive in from that initial starting point. So one, if we look at his setup, you'll notice he has a very, very good drift. So as he begins to initiate forward, it's a little bit more subtle of a drift than someone like a Jacob deGrom, but still a fairly pronounced drift. So he's not coming to a balance point, right? If you were to pause him at peak leg lift and tell him to hold that position, right? He couldn't hold that position because he's begun to shift his center of mass forward away from the rubber. And so he's actually begun this controlled fall. And one way of thinking about this is if you look at his head position from when he lifts his leg, you can kind of ask, like, does the head shift backwards towards second base or not? And in his case, you can clearly see as he lifts, his head begins to move forward. A lot of players will initiate that leg lift by shifting back towards second base. There's a weight shift back and then forward. So with him, as he begins to lift his leg, his head never shifts backwards. Everything is initiated forwards, and that's how he begins the drift. Again, he's under control. He's very stable through that back foot. He's still in a stacked trunk position. His eyes are on the target in this case. And he's gotten his center of mass shifting away from the rubber. At this point, there is not substantial tension through the backside. He's stable, but he hasn't created max tension through this rear hip quite yet. Another thing I want to bring to your attention is the angle of the shoulders. So as he lifts his leg, and I've kind of talked about the seesaw effect for a number of years now. As he lifts the leg, he's in this drift phase. He's really trying to get everything going forward towards the target. And then as he gets into the following phase, the hinge phase, that's when everything kind of shifts into the backside. It's like stay back mode. Stay in the backside, stay in the backside, stay loaded, stay back. But as he's moving forward, it's the opposite. It's move forward, get everything going forward. So you can actually see, it's subtle, but you can see as he shifts forward, he actually has a little bit of a dip of his front shoulder. So he goes from the shoulders being level during a set position to as he gets to that peak leg lift and begins to initiate that forward move. Again, the head only moves forward, he stays stacked, he stays stable. You can see now those shoulders are angled actually downwards 3, 4, 5 degrees, setting up the following move out of that so that as he does get into his backside, he can avoid getting excessively uphill. So you can see as he actually does get into his hinge, get into the kind of pinnacle of that linear move, he's still relatively level with the horizon. Whereas a lot of players, when that first move begins to tip them uphill and their shoulders begin to go up 5, 10, 15 degrees, then as they get into their back leg, now the shoulders end up 25, 30, 35 degrees uphill. So by kind of presetting a little bit of that kind of downward shoulder tilt during the drift, as he then gets into his backside, he's going to end up in a little bit more level of a position, as opposed to starting off already uphill, and then as he gets into his backside, he ends up even more uphill. So again, something in my own personal career really helped, having a little bit of like a kind of a dip of that front shoulder during the first move, and I would end up being a little bit more level as I actually move towards the target, which would help actually get downhill at landing and into ball release. Again, we now get into the hinge, and one of the first things you'll notice, and this jumped out at me, you know, the very first time I looked at his mechanics, is how much of an IR dominant pitcher he is. And again, by IR, we're talking about internal rotation, rear hip internal rotation. So you can think of it, it almost looks like his back knee is caving in right there, where the knee starts to shoot forward. Again, this isn't actually the knee caving inwards or valgus position. It kind of looks like it from this side view, but it's really that rear hip internally rotating. And so what he's doing here is he's finding this position of max tension. He's creating tension through this rear hip. So he has a certain degree of pelvic coil, not a ton, but he's getting most of that tension, most of that internal rotation from below, from this femur, as opposed to if you imagine a more vertical shin position and the pelvis coiling, you know, over top of that would be more of like a pelvic driven tension. So he's creating that tension from below, from the femur side. Now, this is a pretty clear indication that he is what I would call an IR dominant pitcher. He's got a decent amount of hip internal rotation. I mean, you can see the range of motion he's getting into at the hip here. This is in line with his motor preference, or if you want to call it a movement bias. This is how his body wants to create stability and produce force through the ground from his back leg. And again, pretty clear just from how comfortable he is producing power in this joint angle in this position. Easy to see in retrospect with a guy throwing 104 that he's likely in close to his optimal mechanics for his body type. If we look at the position as he moves forward, right, he drops into this backside, he drops into the hinge. And as we look at the positions here, we're looking for some sort of pelvic and trunk stack position. So we're looking for the relationship between where the pelvis is and where the trunk is to be relatively lined up here. You don't want to see somebody way too uphill, leaking way too far forward, leaning way back towards first base, or leaning and leaking way forwards towards third base. So you're looking for some relative stacked position. Again, he's about 10 degrees above the horizon with this pelvic angle, which is within an acceptable range. But again, once that pelvis starts to tip way uphill, it becomes very difficult to actually maintain that stacked relationship and transfer that into rotation, into landing. So again, you can think about throwing a punch. You again want to keep your hips underneath you as you're throwing that punch. It's really the same thing in pitching. So as he moves forward, again, in this internal rotation dominant load, one thing to realize is a lot of coaches out there will coach this vertical shin position, which is really the opposite of what Mason Miller is doing. And I would argue if Mason Miller was coached into holding this knee back, if he was coached into holding a vertical shin, if he was coached into keeping the weight on the outside of that back foot, he likely wouldn't be who he is today. He wouldn't be where he is today. And I would argue so far as he's probably a 94, 96 guy, a 95, 97 guy. If you were to force him to lose that stability through this entire chain from the ground, from the foot, through the tibia, through that femur, the second you put a guy with this kind of range of motion and he's having to wind all that slack out of this backside, the second you remove that ability to create tension and you create more slack by putting him in a vertical shin, he's not going to have the same stability upon which to rotate as he does here. So he's wound into full tension, which gives him a stable base upon which to unload his pelvis at the last second. So again, he's not in a ton of wind or ton of tension here. Right there, boom, he drops into it. He's found this IR dominant position. He's created tension. He's holding that tension. He's holding that tension. He's riding the tension sideways, riding the tension sideways. The belt buckle stays facing third base. He's riding it sideways. He begins to unload that last second. And you can see the pelvis pops open into landing at the last second. And again, it's because he has this tension created. He's removed the slack from that backside that he's able to powerfully unload the hips. And it's because he has this trunk in a relatively stacked position, as opposed to, losing that relationship, that as he unloads the pelvis, he's able to keep the trunk in a good position to actually accept that unload and send as much of that energy up the chain and ultimately out and around into the arm as possible. So again, I would be careful, any of you guys out there, if everybody on your team, if you're doing any sort of vertical shin type drills or type cueing, again, can work for certain guys, but really, really will not work for guys who have this kind of movement preference or movement bias where their body prefers this IR dominant load. So if you have a lot of internal rotation, again, just be cautious with the vertical shin type cues. He's a guy who, if we kind of go to landing, towards the upper end of the average stride length range, he's striding about 70 inches, he's 77 inches tall, 6'5", so about 90-91% of his height from what I could tell in our video analysis software. Again, we might be off by a couple percent because we don't have an actual mocap or StatCast data on him. Towards the upper end of average, but nothing crazy, nothing like Tim Lincecum. He's not like leaping off the rubber. He's doing a good job of riding the backside tension as long as his body can hold it, unloading that, and again, not cheating to get more extension. He's not cheating to artificially lengthen that stride. And again, we can go back to his percentile rankings. You look at extension, again, that's one of the few things that he's not off the charts on, 63rd percentile. Again, extension is not the end all be all if you're gonna sacrifice posture, rotational efficiency, velocity to chase extension, to try to chase perceived velocity. Sure, he might gain a mile an hour of perceived velocity, but he might lose 2, 3, 5 miles an hour if he starts to leap off the backside, extend early, reach out in front, adopt a linear forward flexing finish. Ultimately that would probably not be a worthwhile trade-off to try to chase this extension metric artificially. So again, be careful chasing extension if that ends up leading to, which normally it will, some sort of compensation further up the chain. Stride length is more of an indirect thing that I don't place a ton of stock into, as long as a guy is somewhere in that big picture range of 75 to 80% of height, all the way up to 90-95% of height. Again, he's right in that range towards the upper end of what you typically see. So that rotation phase, we've talked about the trunk stack, talked about him maintaining that relationship. Another thing to point out is he is allowing the pelvis to initiate the unload as opposed to beginning to pull open early from the upper half. And this is where a lot of the sequencing issues happen within the kinematic sequence. Is what we ideally want to see is this upper half does not begin to extend early until the pelvis actually begins to rotate. So as the pelvis begins to unload, you can think of it like a gear analogy. The pelvis goes, and that unloading of the pelvis kick starts the rest of that unload up the chain. But a lot of lower level pitchers will begin to lean back early, begin to extend early, and really not being patient with the front side, not being patient with the upper half, and waiting for the pelvis to actually initiate that unload. So you want the pelvis to start that wave of energy that gets sent up the chain. You don't want the upper half to be coming into the throw too soon, or it completely screws up the order of operations and that whip-like mechanism that we're trying to create. Let's pull up his college video, one of the first videos you can find. And one of the things you'll see is there's a lot of similarities in his mechanics. He's mentioned in interviews that he hasn't tried to change a ton, but one of the things he does do a lot better is he's rotating significantly better now than he did. And so if we take him into his peak drive, we can see how much more forward his trunk is, his posture just leaking more towards third base rather than staying a little bit more stacked, a little bit more upright as he is now. We can see what this ends up leading to, which is a little bit more of an extending back leg. So you can see that back leg kind of extends and pushes, and he has a harder time actually rotating from that position. So he ends up getting into a little bit of an early extension pattern where that quad becomes over involved on the back leg. Now, obviously he was a lot skinnier, a lot weaker. There's a lot of other considerations why he was 91, 93, touching 95. But again, one consideration is certainly the mechanical efficiency. And because of this, he's also ending up in a little bit more of an open early torso rotation position. And if we look at the lead leg block, he's coming more out and around, a little more cross body, and then he's coming out and around into that block. And he almost has like a double clutch action on that block. So he initially touches toe first because he's beginning to leak forward towards the catcher and also forward towards third base. Toe hits down first, then the heel hits, and then there's like a double clutch where the foot doesn't get a stable landing, and then it finally plants once he's already open. So again, all of this kind of stemming in college from a little bit more of a quad dominant load. He begins leaking forward and towards third base, leading to this early extension pattern. And then again, going back to where he is currently, more upright posture, more glute dominant load, better direction. And you can see that direction the knee takes as he actually unloads, rotates the pelvis instead of extending the knee. You can see that knee snaps down to the ground as the pelvis rotates, as opposed to extending from the quad. So some subtle but important changes that he has been able to make since college. If we go to his block, the first thing I noticed when I looked at his block, the first thing I thought of was Justin Verlander. So you notice at landing, right, his pelvis is, call it 30 degrees, give or take, open, kind of towards that lower end of the range you normally see. But then as he plants on that front foot, the pelvis completes its rotation over the next 2.5 frames. And as it completes that rotation, that glove side pelvis is pulling that lead leg femur, and it's pulling that knee into extension. So you can see just that absolute electric lead leg block. And you can see it almost looks like he has a little bit of knee hyperextension potentially here as well, similar to Justin Verlander. But yeah, not getting a ton of extension. He's not way out over his front side, a little bit more upright finished. Again, very similar to kind of how Justin Verlander's finish is as well. You can also see how he comes down into the lead leg. So we call this rotating down into landing, but he's actually rotating from this point. He's rotating down from above. He's not coming out and around. He's not landing from the side. But what you want, if you can rotate down from above, then you get a really nice, clean, firm plant on that foot. And you can see, as opposed to in college where he was landing more toe dominant, toe first, he's landing on the full foot evenly, again, down from above, so he gets a really clean plant. And then as he continues to rotate, you can see that direction of the unload really leads itself to this highly efficient lead leg block. I would say that's one of the more impressive or kind of outlier pieces of his mechanics. Look at the upper half now. So we can talk about the arm spiral, and then we'll look at the acceleration and the deceleration. First off, you can see the handbrake is a little bit late. Again, not necessarily in a good or bad way, but the hands break later than you would normally expect. So this is likely a factor in why the arm ends up being a little bit later at landing than you might see in some other pitchers. And it has to do with the timing of that handbrake. So normally you might see the hands break right here. In most, quote unquote, most pitchers, he delays it 6 or 7 frames later than normal. And so he doesn't actually break his hands until very late in the process. And again, he hasn't given his arm much time to actually get up in plane. He is a guy who seems to have very long arms. I would hazard a guess that as a 6'5" guy, he might have 6, 7, 8, 9-inch wingspan. And so he's not giving his longer wingspan time to necessarily get up on time. Not necessarily saying he should change it, but one of the reasons that his arm is likely a little bit late has to do with how late that initial handbrake is. Again, there's a whole another conversation of, is that worth the trade-offs of actually making that change or adjustment? And given how he's throwing, he absolutely should not make any changes at this point in time. We look at the glove arm, we look at the throwing arm, and how they're working in opposition, right? If you've watched these videos for any length of time, you'll know I don't necessarily like the term equal and opposite, because it's not like they're doing the exact same thing as each other. The timing of that scapular retraction is different. They have different roles, but at the same time, they should work together. They should work in opposition, and largely the degree of elbow extension will roughly mirror each other in most cases. You typically won't see super high glove sides with super low slot throwing arms. And so these should work together. And so he does a good job of the glove arm working in tandem with the throwing arm to create some rhythm and to roughly match the plane of rotation that he's going to end up in with his throwing arm. If we go to landing, again, you can kind of see he's right on the borderline where you might consider this late at landing from just a general external rotation standpoint. Again, right around 35, 45 degrees of external rotation, which again is borderline, potentially on time, but more so from the side view, you can see where potentially the concerns would lie. And this has to do with how much elbow extension he's still in. So arm lagging definitely a little bit outside of plane. Again, would ideally like to see this a little bit closer to 90 degrees of elbow flexion or extension. And so could argue there's a little bit of an arm lag here. again, he's aware of. This is something that he's talked about in interviews. And you can see the very next frame, he does get that arm a little bit more in plane, and he's reasonably close to 90 degrees of elbow flexion at this point. He's a little bit outside of it. So again, kind of a borderline thing. He's aware of it. He mentioned in an interview that his medical staff, isn't a huge fan of certain pieces here, the arm timing. I'm assuming they're probably also kind of zeroed in on this being like a yellow flag as well. And the reason this might be a yellow flag may be somewhat of an injury risk, just has to do with the anatomy of the UCL and the anterior bundle, and that anterior bundle being tensioned in relative elbow extension. And so he's not in like that huge red flag range, right here as he's really accelerating, but he's also, probably on the very far end of what you'd expect to see. Again, would I personally recommend he changes anything? Absolutely not. Not when he's having this level of success. But at the same time, we're all aware he got injured last year. He did sprain the UCL. And so it's just something to keep an eye on. It's something that could be worth a conversation with his staff in the future. And I'm sure they would have that conversation if anything were to happen where it would become some sort of like consistent issue. But for now, again, seems to be recovering. He's one of the best pitchers in baseball. And so it doesn't mean just because something represents a minor inefficiency or a minor yellow flag that something has to be changed. It's all a matter of trade-offs, and certain things actually allow guys to be successful and sync up for their mechanics, their off speed, the pitch movement, the deception. And so again, these are all things to factor into the equation. It's not just about, injury prevention above all else, or teams would just be marching guys out there who threw 88 miles an hour, not trying to throw max effort. But again, we've seen a guy throwing 102, like you see that plays. Velocity is hard to hit, and just is the reality of the situation. So we look at the acceleration and deceleration path. Does the arm unwind in plane? Yes, absolutely. So you can see he gets a really nice pull through his throwing arm pec. So he gets some of that kind of lag where he's creating this gigantic stretch through that entire anterior oblique sling. He's creating thoracic extension. He's really slingshotting everything through. He's creating that whip-like mechanism. He's sequencing the kinematic, sequence efficiently. The pelvis is going first, and then the trunk. Then he's got elbow extension, and then finally shoulder internal rotation. He's creating this absolute whip-like mechanism and that big pull through that throwing arm pec. You can see where is he hitting that layback? He's hitting that layback back behind the ear, back behind the nose. So he's getting that big pull into ball release, and that arm is unwinding and unfurling in plane. Again, shoulder to elbow in a straight line. Again, everything is unfurling in plane. One thing to point out, and you can't really see it from this angle, but you can tell he has a little bit of wrist deviation. And so he's actually kind of cheating his hand up to get the fingers a little bit more on top of the ball, despite the actual plane of rotation. So this is the plane of rotation right about here. And you can see he's actually creating a little bit of a higher axis. I don't know that this is necessarily intentional, but he's kind of cheating the wrist through a little bit of deviation to get on top of the ball a little bit better. And I think that's smart because it's not necessarily affecting his release point a ton. He's still able to create some vertical approach angle, but he's able to create a little bit more induced vertical break from this. Walker Buehler is another guy that does this well. But again, just something small that could be giving him an extra inch and a half, 2 inches of induced vertical break just from cheating the fingers a little bit more on top of the ball. Obviously, he's finishing with absolute electricity from this point. One of the fastest arms I think any of us have ever seen. And so I think what's important to realize is there is definitely some active contribution of the final link in the chain. So there is that final contribution of pull from the internal rotators, from the pec minor, the lat, the subscap. There's absolutely right here that active final pull from the upper half, and that's why upper body strength training is so effective at increasing velocity. But it's also augmented by all the energy momentum that he's been building through the entire rest of the throw. So there is that final pull from the upper half, but there's also being able to sequence it properly such that he's created tension, built up linear momentum, unloaded that linear momentum, converted it into angular or rotational momentum, properly sequence it up the chain because the torso is in a stacked position and well-timed and not coming to the throw too soon. And now as he begins to rotate, he's able to augment all the energy and momentum from the lower half with this final aggressive pull from the internal rotators of the arm. And it's that proper timing of that entire wave of energy that's creating that final electricity in the throw. So let's look a little bit about how he got there. Again, most of you guys are probably familiar with his general story. He's a guy who, came into college not throwing the hardest, right? He was at a Division III college. He had a 7 ERA his first year. He had a 7 ERA his second year. He was 6'5", 175. His second year, he dropped unexplained. He dropped to 155 pounds, was rail thin. He had a routine drug test for a summer internship and came back, alarming. And they told him ultimately that, hey, you actually have type 1 diabetes. Got that addressed, came back, had a breakout season the next year. The following year, he was up to 200 pounds, 91, 95 miles an hour. That's the clip we already looked at. 2021, transferred to Gardner-Webb, had a great year. Upper 90s that year, hit 99 miles an hour at the MLB Combine, which was the top velocity of that event, drafted in the 3rd round. And then it's really just been this explosive climb since that point, where he really didn't have, a ton of time in the minor leagues before being called up. And he was called up at 230 pounds from what we could find online. So putting on 75 pounds from his lowest weight to throwing 104 miles an hour. Like, the weight clearly matters, but as he's talked about in a number of interviews, obviously good weight. Fat doesn't contract. It's not just about putting on mass for the sake of putting on mass. It's about putting on good weight that can actually allow you to get in and out of positions, hold positions, create more stability, ultimately improve your power output as well. He's put on good weight. You can tell he's definitely still a very lean guy, 6'5", 230. Just a good lesson about, you don't really know how much potential somebody has. Like, you would never have said that this D3 kid throwing 88 miles an hour could be throwing 104. But how many other guys out there who are throwing 86, 88? How many tall, lanky D3 guys, D2 guys, NAI guys throwing 89, right, could be throwing 99, right? The answer is greater than 0. Like, there exists a lot more potential in especially the lower levels of college baseball than people necessarily think. It's just guys that haven't put it together to throw 93 in time to graduate high school to actually get on a major Power 5 school. So there's actually a lot of talent at the lower levels of college baseball, and it's just untapped potential. It's untapped talent because there's some limiting factor there that, they haven't figured out yet. With type 1 diabetes specifically, gets back to he couldn't produce insulin. And again, that's a very important piece of the muscle building process. And so he was really missing this key ingredient in the muscle building process, which is why he was having so much time putting on size, why he had unexplained weight loss. And lots that goes into properly putting on good size. There's the weightlifting, there's the protein intake, there's the calorie intake, but then also there's the hormones, there's the testosterone, there's the insulin. All these other hormones are also playing a key role. So bottom line is, like, any one factor isn't present in this whole development process. Like, it can become the rate limiter, it can become the limiting factor for that entire process. It just goes to show how explosive that progress can be once you address that rate limiter, once you address that one thing that might be holding you back. A couple other examples of this. Josh James, you guys might remember, he had a meteoric rise from upper 80s, low 90s to touching 100 miles an hour. And in his case, it had to do with, he got a sleep apnea diagnosis and really, addressed his recovery for the first time. Didn't realize that he really hadn't been recovering properly. Got that sorted out, really just took off once you really start to recover. We've worked with guys who had celiac disease and it stunted their growth all through high school until they really got that figured out. They just weren't able to, properly absorb nutrients. And so that kind of brings up this question of holistic approach to player development, where you can't just look at any one thing in isolation. You can't just approach everything as a mechanics problem or a strength problem or a mobility problem. Right? If the blood work isn't right, if the hormones aren't right, if the nutrition isn't right, if the sleep isn't right, all these other pieces factor into player development, and we can't ignore any one of those pieces. And so, like, he would be just like a really big picture kind of framework for development as a whole. Might want to screenshot this, but it's just something I've been kind of thinking through, and just a rough sketch for this video of kind of like how I think through the process. But we need to look at improving stuff and pitchability. Each of these have a number of pillars that kind of go into it. Each of those pillars have a ton more detail below that. Again, any one of these can be the limiting factor, can be the weak link that stops the entire rest of the process from improving. If you want to improve your stuff and you don't have a good S&C program, if you're messing up on the mobility side, if you're messing up on some aspect of the nutrition recovery side, if you're screwing it up on the mechanical efficiency side, if all this is going great but you don't have a pitch design process, if all that's going great but you don't have a mental preparation process, you don't have any idea how to use the data and analytics and pitch usage, any of these things are screwed up and you're not optimizing your potential. And so does your plan, is what you're doing right now, looking at it from a holistic standpoint, to be able to catch any of these potential rate limiters? We take a look at his arsenal. Again, he's a guy with a little bit more of a vertical profile, as far as he's kind of simplified it with four-seam slider. Slider has a little bit of sweep to it, but he actually did have a very good cutter. He had a good changeup, and they aren't pitches that he's had to use a ton. And I actually agree with this approach, where he's just throwing his best stuff more. He's simplifying. It seems to be working. His velocity is up from 98.3 to 100.7 over the past year. His whiff percentage has more than doubled. First pitch strike percentage is up almost 25%. Walk percentage is down. His fastball spin rate is up 150. So again, whether that has to do with how tight he's gripping the ball, finger width, flipping the four seam to a different orientation, different things that could account for that. But something he's doing here is working, and comes back to simplifying the process, as simple as he can possibly make it. He mentioned in the pitching interview that he had trouble throwing a sweeper, but he seemed interested in possibly adding a sweeper to the arsenal, but was having trouble with a two-seam orientation on the sweeper. Again, there are other ways to throw a sweeper that don't require that two-seam orientation with a ton of supination. And so happy to get into that in another video if anybody's interested in some other grips or other ways to throw a sweeper. Comparisons. We look at his fastball, had our team put together this comparison graphic of just how good his fastball really is. You think about prime Aroldis Chapman. You think about Ryan Helsley, Felix Bautista, right? These are the guys that were the closest comparisons we could find. Ryan Helsley, Bautista, again, similar in induced vertical break, similar on the horizontal break. None of these guys have a ton of arm side. Spin rate, similar across the board. You look at the fastball whiff rate, Mason Miller topping all of them, 48.6%. Fastball end zone rate, again, top of the list as well, just pounding the zone and just inducing an insane amount of whiffs. Another thing I think is interesting when watching him pitch, but also not that surprising, is that he's throwing a lot of middle fastballs. The catcher is set up middle in a lot of cases, and he is just absolutely bringing it down the middle as hard as he can and saying, let's see if you can hit this. Now, he's not necessarily ending up middle every time, which is kind of the point. He's giving himself more of the plate to work with. He's throwing it hard and aggressively. He's throwing his best stuff more. He's throwing it over the plate. He's challenging hitters. He's saying, hit my stuff. And if he misses his spot by 6 inches, by 8 inches, he's still somewhere around the zone, as opposed to trying to be so perfect. And again, you might say this is only a strategy that can work for a guy because he throws 100 miles an hour. To some extent, you're right. That velocity gives him a lot more room for error to be able to use that type of approach. But really at any level, at the high school level, at the college level, if you have above average to elite stuff for your level, this can be a very valid strategy. And if you're having command issues, regardless of your stuff, I would still argue that giving yourself a more centralized focal point over the plate, even if you're missing your spot by a foot, it's now missing on a corner. If you actually get to the point where you start pounding middle every single pitch, well, great, you don't have a command issue anymore. And you can start splitting the plate up into halves or thirds, top of the zone, bottom of the zone. But that can be a really helpful way to kind of serve as a reset for a guy who is having command issues as well. It's just have the catcher set up a little bit more centrally, a little bit more centralized focal point. And can be really helpful, as opposed to trying to nibble corners and be super fine. And then a couple more miscellaneous things to finish out. He's a big weight room guy, is worth mentioning. The weight room isn't just something you get in, get out, right? Really applying yourself to what you're doing there, treating each rep as though it's the most important rep of your career, devoting yourself to the nutrition side, devoting yourself to the recovery side. He mentioned like, hey, that first 25, 30 pounds came back pretty quick, just once he got the hormone levels in balance, but he had to earn the rest of it. And so that 75 pounds he gained back, he earned more than half of that. He's also a guy who's very intelligent and up to date with his data, his analytics. He wants to understand the process. I think that's a great theme that we're seeing more and more with some of these top guys is taking ownership of their career. It's not just the prototypical like big dumb pitcher stereotype where it's just like, oh, we just need to be dumb out there and not think. And you're seeing a lot more cerebral pitchers who are taking ownership of their careers. I think that's just a really cool trend to see that emerging more and more where that's almost becoming the norm. Spencer Striders and Mason Millers, you're seeing that emerge a lot more. Players are now empowered with the education to take advantage, take ownership of their careers more than in years past. Again, talked about the mental game a little bit already. He mentioned in his interview with Rob Friedman, I'm not trying to think too much, throw his best stuff more. He said, would I rather get beat on my best pitch in the zone or walk a guy? Right? He's pitching to contact, he's being efficient and early in counts, he's lowering his pitch counts, which should allow him to have a little bit more longevity in the long term. Post a clip right here so you can kind of see that, where he explains his thought process.
As far as the mindset goes, being in the zone, don't try and make the perfect pitch, make good pitches, the great stuff will come.
That's a great point, because I know the Rays strategy, and I talked to Glasnow about this, is throw your best stuff in the zone and don't think too much. Like everybody's told you growing up, like major league guys, oh, they're going to hit anything over the plate. You got to hit your spots. You got to do this. When your stuff is that good, it's almost like let it eat and, throw in these general zones, but it's about your stuff and not about, micro targeting things.
Yeah. And I definitely felt like, when I came up, I did have to be a little bit more fine because, that's just the fact of the matter. You're facing the best of the best. But, thinking more about it, would I rather get beat on my best pitch in the zone and the guy takes me yard, or would I rather, take a guy through an 8-pitch at bat, walk him? That's definitely something I'm challenging myself to do, moving forward, is be efficient, give a guy my best stuff early in counts, go right at him.
So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed that breakdown. Overall, super electric, exciting player to watch. He does a lot of things very efficiently in his mechanics, but this also comes down to what he's doing off the field, what he did from a recovery standpoint, identifying the limiting factors for his recovery, getting his diagnosis, getting his nutrition, his hormones in check, and cleaning up some things mechanically as well. Obviously, wishing the best for him. Hope he has a long, healthy, successful career, and excited to see him continue dominating hitters this year. Thanks again for watching, guys. And if you have any comments for additional pitchers that I should break down, drop that down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks again.